The problem with Nicolas speech, Madam Chair, members of this House, is that entirely all of his arguments actually work in our favor. Why? Because let's talk about the first argument of conflict of interests. He says, Mr. Chair, members of this House, that these people earn a lot from people's emotions, and therefore, Madam Chair, members of this House, won't have the motivation to actually pursue stricter implementations of policies against these fans because it will lessen their profits. But you say, Madam Chair, members of this House, that's exactly the analysis that came from Dino, which he didn't rebut. These people, Madam Chair, members of this House, are in here for business, and at the end of the day, they want money. But if you give them a big stick, or a disincentive, Mr. Chair, members of this House, of actually allowing people to file class action lawsuits against them, or actually allowing governments, Madam Chair, members of this House, to file UEFA and ask them to pay for all of the billions of dollars or millions of of damages, Madam Chair, members of this House, to the burned cars and whatever, Madam Chair, members of this House. Obviously, that profit, that profit, Madam Chair, members of this House, will indeed be lessened. Moreover, Madam Chair, members of this House, so we say again that the conflict of interest actually works in our favor, Madam Chair, members of this House, because it actually is the incentive for UEFA to actually work for, Madam Chair, better and less emotional matches. But let's talk about, Madam Chair, members of this House, how indeed the effectivity is more apparent in our proposal, because that's something that says, Madam Chair, this idea that there is a spillover effect on society that UEFA and their private security forces will not be able to deal with, Madam Chair, members of this House. We say, number one, Madam Chair, members of this House, that again, UEFA, given that they're a billion-dollar business, has more resources, Madam Chair, members of this House, financial or otherwise, to actually hire, Madam Chair, members of this House, how many private security forces are needed to actually contain a possible riot. Moreover, in our proposal, we gave UEFA actual 100% discretion, Madam Chair, members of this House, of whether or not they're going to actually include police forces from the national government and allow them inside the stadiums. So, policemen, Madam Chair, members of this House, are not mutually exclusive to their side. We can have them too. But at the end of the day, Madam Chair, members of this House, we say that at the end of the day, we feel that requiring UEFA to actually hire private security forces, because they're going to be held liable if they don't do so, Madam Chair, members of this House, results in a safer tournament for everyone. But lastly, let's talk about their other criteria which they introduced but never really answered. Why should primary decision-making fall on UEFA's shoulders, Madam Chair, members of this House? Simple. Because UEFA has been doing it since the beginning of the tournament, Madam Chair, members of this House. They know what kind of problems arise whenever a tournament happens, Madam Chair, members of this House. While some countries and national governments have never even hosted a UEFA Cup, and that's the first time members of this House to actually implement that kind of tournament. We say that given that they have more knowledge and more experience handling these particular tournaments, primary decision-making has to fall on their shoulders. Yes. No point of information. So, okay, let's go on to my argumentation. My first argument, Madam Chair, members of this House, falls again on the effectiveness argument, on how consistency and standardization of rules and laws. Sit down. I keep on asking you for POIs. Let's talk about consistency and standardization of laws, Madam Chair and members of this House. Because we say that the problem with the status quo is that the mechanisms against hooliganism are not consistently in place and are arbitrarily decided by national governments, thereby confusing fans. I.e., Madam Chair, members of this House, some countries, Madam Chair, will not allow face paint and will not allow logos of what kind of which team you're actually supporting, but others will actually promote, Madam Chair, members of this House, fierce competition between the fans. We say, Madam Chair, members of this House, that this confuses fans who follow these tournaments. They don't know what rules will be followed for that particular tournament, and therefore do not know, Madam Chair, members of this House, whether or not they're doing the right thing. Moreover, Madam Chair, members of this House, this creates the problem of rules not being taken seriously. Why, Madam Chair, members of this House? Because obviously, Madam Chair, members of this House, you can do this at one tournament and the other tournament you can't, Madam Chair, members of this House. Meaning that some hooligans are punished and some hooligans aren't, Madam Chair and members of this House. Moreover, we say that the rules imposed, Madam Chair, members of this House, and the enforcement of these rules are dependent on the ability of the country to actually enforce these particular rules or the strength of their security forces, Madam Chair, members of this House. What if it is held in a country that doesn't have a good police force, Madam Chair and members of this House? Who is going to enforce it? Hello, of these particular security forces, they also have to take care of the vast majority of the people living in the city. Madam Chair, members of this House. That's why we need a complementary policy to the one that is instituted in the government today. Yes. Any point? Okay, let's go on, Madam Chair, and members of this House, to the contrast between the effectivity of police only versus the effectivity of police plus the security forces, Madam Chair, members of this House, that UEFA will actually forward. We say, Madam Chair, members of this House, that obviously the effectiveness, Madam Chair, members of this House, is significantly lessened if you rely only on the police, Madam Chair, members of this House, for the security peace tournaments. Why? Because we're talking about a stadium filled with people, Madam Chair, members of this House. How many policemen can an actual national government delegate, Madam Chair, members of this House, for one particular policy or one particular tournament, Madam Chair, members of this House? We say that that number is significantly limited, Madam Chair, members of this House, when you actually see a proposal wherein UEFA hires private security forces that has police as well, Madam Chair, and members of this House. We say that at the end of the day, when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, all emotionally charged, Madam Chair, members of this House, we say that the cooperation of the police and other security forces, Madam Chair, will lead, Madam Chair, in better prevention of the problem, number one, and number two, better ability to contain it once it spills out, if it does happen. At the end of the day, Madam Chair, and members of this House, we also say that right now the problem with the status quo is that the police and the UEFA, even if they do have separate security mechanisms, Madam Chair, and members of this House, do not have, Madam Chair, does not necessarily have parallel mechanisms, Madam Chair, members of this House, meaning that the cooperation and the communication lines between the two of them, Madam Chair, members of this House, is not straightforward. Whether or not the police will reign over the UEFA security forces, or whether or not the UEFA security forces have primary decision-making capability. If we make this clear, Madam Chair, members of this House, then we have a comprehensive and complementary policy that will best address the problem. My partner talked about, Madam Chair, why the political leverage of addressing the target audience is more apparent in our proposal. I talked about how indeed our policy is complementary and the benefits of their side are not mutually exclusive to theirs. Thanks.